How will you pick your main? What will do the most damage? Which healer will have the best cooldowns for raids? Will Blood Decay be the best tank in Mythic Plus? Or should you just do what people say and play what's fun while they pick the meta specs and get all the invites into groups? There are a few criteria that objectively people can use to determine what spec to play to main or to alt. While there might be some debate as to what's missing or what's extra, in my opinion, these are what will influence people's decisions the most. We will be using this mock-up table since it's easy to follow, easy to edit, and easy to explain what's what. First of all is performance. This is probably the trickiest and hardest to gauge based on beta testing and essentially incomplete game design. People have been able to predict this in the past with minimal margins of error, which is how Race World First guilds managed to get their rosters done. But you may have also noticed that not all guilds have had the same roster all the time, meaning that they either decided some other spec would perform better or were inaccurate with their data. This is just to say that, sure, you can see the numbers in game, watch the meta tier list from us or other content creators, and still be wrong, although maybe not 100% wrong. If performance is an important factor to you, even though in our Meta Sucks video we go over why going for meta spec is not always the best thing, then there are a few places you can get an accurate assessment of what might be good. First would be for you to actually play the beta or PTR server with the specs in question at a training dummy or in raids and Mythic Plus and see for yourself which one you perform the best with, assuming you have relatively equal skill expression across all of the specs. That might be time consuming. Also, welcome to making spec and class content on YouTube. Haha! Another source would be the Simulation Craft website, link below. People actually sim the expected performance of the specs to get an ideal number. Now, to my knowledge, the sims run a template character with a predetermined set of items and stats that you may not have for your own characters, so the sims will never be 100% accurate, but they would be as accurate as predicted calculations can be. A likely more in-depth source of information would be the class discords. The theory crafters do good research and simulations and actual testing as well. Plus, talking to people that keep tabs on all of the spec changes will give you access to information that has context. They can tell you, hey, listen, in this raid and likely at your skill level, this might work better for you, and stuff like that. Not only that, the people there can actually clarify the information that numbers behind sims and tier lists can mean, since, as we know, all of these data-driven sources of information are always lacking some level of context that people don't realize and take for granted. In the end, performance-based decisions will always have a lack of reliability because even if the theory crafters and class discords are 100% right, even if the sims are 100% correct, Blizzard can do one last-minute nerf just before the season starts that would bump your spec down a few places and making picking your main a pain. Picking your main is not as important as picking your career, and for back-end web development, there is no better way to start than with today's sponsor, boot.dev. And that's because boot.dev will help you learn back-end web development from start to finish in the programming languages Python and Go, and you just don't learn it in any boring way you might be expecting, since the people at boot.dev really believe that the best way to learn is to actually have fun when doing it. Who would have thought? If only my school teachers wouldn't have known that, maybe I would have learned more code as well. And they deliver on it with the process of you learning being like playing an RPG game where you acquire experience points per lessons completed, level up, complete quests and earn achievements. And you do all of this while just writing a lot of code, because just like improving in WoW and any other aspect of life, the best way to get better is to get your hands on the keyboard, type and type and type and just ship a lot of projects out. Programming is a career that gets more popular each year, and it fits us gamers so well since you have the option to work from home, something that's been way appealing to a lot of people. And if you have questions or get stuck at any point through these lessons, boot.dev even has an active Discord community where you can get people there to help you out. To get started, make sure you click the link in the description below and use our code Marcelian Online to get 25% off of your first purchase, which can mean anything from your first month of the subscription to 25% off of the yearly plan if that's what you decide to go with. Thank you Bud.dev for sponsoring this video. As an example, depending on when you watch this video, the information here may not be reliable, which will in turn save to prove my point. If we take my table example, right now, Arcane Mage, Unholy and BM Hunter are some of the best performing specs in the game. Let's assume that they are, so we will give them a rating of 10 out of 10 for performance. Other specs like Fire Mage, which always performs really well, doesn't always have the most damage. The value Fire brings comes from other sources as well, but currently it deals good damage, just not at the level of these other guys, so it gets a 9. Take this with a pinch of salt. The second criteria would be what I call the filling in variable. This is when your friends or guildies ask for a specific class or a spec to synergize well with the roster. This is where team composition is built and where it will matter. This depends, of course, on what your group already has, but assuming it has nothing currently, let's use once again the table I mentioned to paint a picture. Affliction in my ranking gets a 10, and if we had the other Warlock specs here, they would also get a 10. Mostly because the table is for rating, but you can make one for M+ as well. In rating, Warlocks are likely the best single class to ever have if you had to pick one. Gateways and Hellstones, but mostly Gateways, are the singular reason why you would want a Warlock even if its damage is turbo shit. The mechanical advantage of using it during fights is incredible and enables specs with no mobility to fill in the ranks, specs like the priests and shamans. So for that, warlocks are always needed, well, one warlock at least. And with that, I go for the second most wanted class, I believe, which is Death Knight, specifically for the grips. Once again, performance might be relevant. If the raid encounter has adds that need to be gripped, where it would make sense to play a Frost Decay just for that. Of course, Mage gets a similar point because Arcane Intellect is one of the strongest raid buffs after Mark of the Wild, I believe. So on and so forth. The reason I'm using this table isn't to convince you that my ranking is correct, but it is to help you make your own decision. If your group already has a Warlock, the score it might get here actually would be a 0, since you bring no added value to a group by the sheer nature of you being a Warlock, after someone else already gave out the Hellstones and Gateways. So the value specs get here changes based on you. Moving to safe pick, this is something you might be familiar with. A safe pick spec is usually something that will never get nerfed too hard, something that will likely always have a place no matter what. Fire Mage gets a 10 here because of past tiers and statistics, and this is a combination of performance and fill in, even when it does less damage than most specs, is likely the best mage spec consistently. Sometimes Frost can do better, sometimes Arcane can do better, but even so, if we take a generalized approach, Fire's way of dealing damage is way more reliable since you are the most mobile mage spec. Affliction or Warlock in general gets an 8 here. Similar to Mage, it's unlikely you'll ever be useless in a group, and unlikely there will not be a really good use for Gateway, and even if nerfed, you'll still do enough damage when it counts. Now, Affliction has had a rough time over the years, but as a raid spec, it has been the default Warlock choice for years, with the exception of the last maybe one expansion and a half worth of raids. Classes that are most volatile would be Shamans, which just received the raid buff, giving their fill-in score a 9, but their tuning and squishiness have been a point of contention over the years, and most of the time the benefits of a Shaman has been provided more reliably by a resto rather than elemental or enhancement, in my groups anyway. Based on the last few raid tiers, I would rank enhance higher than elemental, and maybe with the upcoming War Within they might go up in score a bit more, or even interchange positions, considering that normally you would want range more than melee, but for that, personally, I would like to see them perform in the Nerbar Palace raid first. The last three categories are giga subjective and also self-explanatory that I don't need to go over too much. Lore or story or class fantasy or class flavor is basically how your character expresses itself within the context of the game. where an Arcane Mage gets a 10 because the story heavily uses their concept with NPCs like Medivh, Khadgar, and most mages in Dalaran. Shadow Priest doesn't really have a noteworthy representation. Sure, we have a lot of cultist type priests that we fight as enemies, but I cannot think of a single representative for the Shadow Spec that would spark my curiosity for the lore of the spec. Fun is pretty obvious. It can encompass the design of the spec, the gameplay, the variety in its builds, but also how challenging it is, or how accessible it is, depending on the player that's ranking it. And last, the MOG section refers mostly to aesthetics. How good does the spec look? Do you have cool transmogs for it? Does an orc warrior look better than a goblin mage? Would you rank the warrior higher than the mage in this category then? Will you pick a demon hunter over a rogue because demon hunters can MOG the warglaves of Azeroth? Again, all up to you. And now, as a little bit extra, I will take 3 specs and rank them here for you so you can see how my thought process works, not for you to mimic, but hopefully to help you create your own thought processes, CZs, and your own ranking based on personal skill, group necessity, and so on. And I will do this live with no edit. Taking Assassination first, in terms of performance, I think we can agree that right now it's a little bit lacking, even though the Sims might say otherwise. As far as I can tell, whether it is for raids or Mythic Plus, Assassination at most would get an 8 in terms of its performance. Damage is always really good, but not always that great. In terms of filling in, you don't really need rogues almost ever, except for when you want to immune things with Cloak of Shadows, but that's been unreliable over the years, and usually you would have the other 2 rogues bring it way quicker than Assassination, so I would probably give this like a 2. Maybe you want a rogue, maybe you want a cloak, maybe you want evasion for some reason, but that's very unlikely, which is why it's getting a 2. In terms of a safe pick, I think it's been one of the most unsafest picks ever. It had really good damage at the beginning of Amir Drasil, but it was terribly nerfed, and it's been very inconsistent with the way it's doing damage and how it matches with encounters. I would probably give this a reasonably 3 because the damage definitely is there sometimes, and considering that I'm using safe pick to kind of combine filling and performance, it's the most shareable I can be. In terms of the lore, it gets a full-on 10. There are a lot of cool assassination rogues that make me feel excited for playing assassination, like Valera, like Tess Greymane, like Vanessa Van Cleef, although we don't really know what specs these rogues embody, but they're mostly assassination rogues, if we're gonna be clear. In terms of fun, Assassination is very fun for me. It has some lackluster things when it comes to its hero talent, so that kind of takes it down a peg. Normally I would probably put Assassination at around like 9 in terms of fun, but with the hero talent, that would probably drop it down to like a 7. Which is a shame because Assassination is just very fun. Mog-wise, I would probably give it a 8. Rogue has really cool transmogs, but not as amazing as with other classes, and it would get an overall ranking of 38 in terms of score compared to some of the other specs that you see here. Feral, in terms of performance, is probably around an 8 as well. It does really good damage. Its tuning is not that bad. It could probably use a buff. Maybe it could even be a 7 based on some of the latest numbers, but not a lot of people play Feral to get an accurate judgment, so I'm just gonna put it at performance. If I play Feral, I'm confident I can do an 8 out of 10 level of damage when it comes to playing in raids or dungeons. Filling in, this is essentially when it comes to, you know, providing a useful thing for the group. Mark of the Wild is very important, and that would probably rank Feral a little bit high. However, you would probably not be the first or the second or maybe even the third druid spec that can provide Innervate to a group, so that will rank it really down. And in terms of utility, based on how the druid talent tree is devised, Feral probably is one of the specs that suffers the most while trying to get actually proper utility. And considering that you're hardly ever the first spec to bring Mark of the Wild, I'm just gonna probably put this at around like 5. I feel like I can contribute to my raid if I ever main a Feral with Mark of the Wild, but I feel like there's always gonna be a Resto Druid, or at the very most maybe a Balanced Druid, even though right now maybe Balance is actually lower than Feral. In terms of a safe pick for Feral, where it's not subject to a lot of big nerfs that would just make it a terrible spec to play, or just giga changes in how the spec expresses itself in a raid, I'll probably put this at around like a 7. it's not going to be amazing. You're not going to top the meters, but you're likely not going to get nerfed into the ground either. In terms of lore, there's not that many feral druids that spark my interest. I don't think the lore is very strong around feral specifically. There are other druid specs that are, represented in the lore a lot more, and that is a little bit of a shame. In terms of fun, I would put this at, it will probably be a 9. I just love how feral plays. It's actually, I'm going to put it at an 8 now that I think about it, because the hero talents just kind of drag it down a little bit. And this is how you can see how the number changes based on my preference. In terms of Mog, I mean, we probably have to consider the druid form specs aesthetics. I'll probably put it at around like a 7. Cats are fine. I feel like they're missing some awesome aesthetics like what bears have gotten and what boomkins have gotten over the years. I think like Feral's a little bit behind on that. Augmentation. Now, when it comes to performance, it has been nerfed recently, but I still feel like augmentation is just going to perform really, really, really well, because if it's not going to perform really well, it's going to be a dead spec, since you either value its utility and the fact that it can keep tanks alive a little bit easier, the multiple dispels and all of that, or you don't value it at all. I don't think there's any in between with augmentation. I think right now it's probably at least going to be a 10, if anything. Filling in, it's probably going to be a 10 as well. There might be some changes once the raid releases, but I feel like the first evoker you would probably ever want in a group would be an augmentation above devastation and evoker. And until they change how the spec functions, I don't think that's ever going to change, considering that augmentation brings everything the other two specs bring, and it's tankier, and it actually helps boost some of the specs in your overall performance. Safe pick, Jesus Christ. I would probably put this at around like 9. It's very close to getting it's very close to getting a top marker here, but I feel like everybody's eyes are on augmentation, and it's likely one of the specs that will probably get the most nerfs or the most consistent nerfs, because it's way too mandatory in almost all of the top end content that the devs probably don't like it that it's so mandatory. So it's likely one that will get some nerfs, but still, even with those nerfs, like I said, that's probably the only reason why I wouldn't get a 10. In terms of lore, I honestly don't really care. I would probably give it a 0. I guess Emberthal is kind of cool. I just don't vibe with the Drakthir lore in general. Fun, I would probably give it a 7. It is pretty fun to play, and the hero talents actually do it justice. Otherwise, it would probably be like a 6 for me. So that's what it would get. And in terms of Mog, it's probably like a 2. You can make your Drakthir and augmentation in this case look kind of cool with all the Drake customization. I'm not a fan of its aesthetics whatsoever. I do, give the devils its due when it comes to the amount of customizational options that Drakthirs have, so that's why it gets a 2. And even though it's perfect in terms of performance, for the more subjective categories, for me, augmentation ranks fairly low, even though I think it's the only spec that got both 10 in performance and the requirement of you having it in a group. And in the end, I can just filter these specs based on performance. If my purpose is big numbers, fun, if I just want to enjoy and not give a fuck about what I do, or the total score if I value all of these categories. Personally, I value fun and lore more than most other categories, which is why I will main Mage over Unholy, even though Unholy in my ranking has a higher overall score. Most people try to find or justify their choice to be meta, and sometimes that's fine, but other times it's not. I mentioned our Meta Sucks video earlier, and you can watch it right now and see what we think when it comes to choosing a spec to play based off of the fact that it is or it isn't a meta spec.